Tremonti, this is The Current.
Is it just me, or is she not as focused as usual?
She missed a few days of work this month. I wonder if there's something wrong at home.
I've noticed you've been away a few days and you seem distracted. Is something going on?
It's hard to ask a coworker whether something's going on, especially when you're worried they're being abused at home. A new campaign out of Western University called Make It Our Business uses a fictional case study to help people concerned that someone they work with is dealing with domestic violence.
Carol is right next to me, and she's got her own cubicle. I can always tell when her husband calls. It was just every day, and to the point where she was reporting all sorts of details, like whether she was on lunch, who she'd be with, when she'd be back. I just had that feeling. I realized I just have to speak to someone. I have to speak to my supervisor.
When Elia came to me and reported what was going on with Carol and her husband, that's when I realized that the warning signs were there all along. I knew as her supervisor that I had a responsibility, and so I asked Carol to come in and meet with me, and I very clearly explained to her what her coworkers and I had witnessed regarding her husband's phone calls.
So I walked into his office and sat down, just sort of bracing myself, and then he just started talking to me about the fact that, coworkers were concerned about me. I wasn't really in a place to help myself, and my coworkers made sure that I got it.
Well, according to a new survey from the Canadian Labour Congress and Western University, 1/3 of workers have experienced domestic violence. 82% of them say the abuse adversely affected their performance on the job. Melissa Corbet has lived what those statistics indicate. She was in an abusive relationship at the beginning of her career, and she joins us now from Ottawa. Hello.
Hello.
Well, tell us a little bit about your life. When did the violence in your home life begin?
The violence in my home life began actually before I was even married. It was months into my relationship. I was only about 23 at the time.
And it continued after you were married?
Yes. I thought getting married would help the situation, and in fact it only continued after the wedding.
And how did that affect your work?
It drastically affected my work. When we were dating, I was working in a position, and I actually was let go because of the phone calls and the behavior and my inability to concentrate.
Your partner was, essentially following you to work through trying to get a hold of you, things like that?
Yes. There was no waiting until after work to talk about things. He would call me at work or sometimes show up, and we would go out at lunch, and I'd come back in tears.
And when you would come back in tears, how would your boss react?
At first, there would be just a quick, are you okay? And I'd say, yes, I just need a minute. And then I'd compose myself and get back to work. But after a while, it was, you can't behave like this at work. You need to be focused, and you need to be on the job when you're here.
And what happened?
I did end up losing that job. I showed up one morning after a particularly bad day the day before, and they let me go. They brought me into their office and let me go and followed me out, and that was a real low point in my life.
Did they tell you it was because of what had been going on?
They said it was because of my behavior and my unreliability.
How long before you got another job?
I got another job quite quickly. I worked for a few months. I took random agency jobs, and then I ended up with a job at the Ontario government, and that's where I still work today, actually.
And the abuse at home was continuing?
It was. I just got better at focusing. I was trying to hold down my job and make sure that I made a good impression and didn't make the same mistakes.
At the same time, were people at the new job willing to talk to you about their suspicions of what you might be going through?
That didn't happen for years, to be honest. For years, there was no indication at work. They could tell I was tired or I wasn't focusing sometimes, but it didn't affect as greatly as it did in the beginning. And then after I had my second child was when I had a really difficult time. And coming back to work, the transition was really tough. And there were a lot of phone calls. And that's when a coworker came to me and asked me if I'd considered talking to our employment assistance program. Now, I had already done that, but I didn't want to admit that. I was trying to protect myself. I thought I needed to hide what was going on, so I said I was fine and thank you for your concern. And it didn't stop there. I had a meeting with my boss. I was being disciplined for missing work, missing time, and being unreliable and not being able to do my duties at work. I was averaging about 2 hours of sleep a night, so you can imagine I wasn't able to focus, and I was on the phone a lot. And the phone calls were very concerning to my coworkers.
What were they overhearing?
They could hear me responding and sounding scared, sometimes trying to rush him off the phone and say, can we talk about this later? A couple times there was, they could probably hear him yelling over the phone at me.
Could they also see bruises?
Yes. There were times where I'd come in and I'd have bruises, and I tried to be careful to hide them, but of course that didn't always work. And so they'd ask what happened, and I'd say, oh, I slept, or the same stories we hear about all the time. I slept, I hit a door, and people were willing to accept those excuses. They didn't want to delve deeper.
And you didn't want them to?
I really didn't want them to.
Would you get dressed in the morning conscious of covering up those bruises?
Absolutely. The getting dressed and putting on makeup became a camouflage act at some times.
And at some point, you did tell them, or they did figure it out? What happened?
When I was finally leaving the relationship, I actually came to work the next day I had pictures of my then husband, and I had to tell people that there was a no contact order. He was not to come in the building. He was not to talk to me or attempt to call me. And so I met with the frontline staff at my work and my boss, and I told them that I was leaving an abusive relationship. Here's what was going on, and that I really needed to be safe at work.
And how did they react?
They were amazing. I was so scared coming out and telling my story. I was worried about being judged, but for the most part, my coworkers were absolutely incredible. I had women that I had been looking up to for years come to me and tell me stories about their lives. These amazing, strong women. You would never imagine what they'd been through to get where they were now.
And they were some of the ones who could tell, that you were going through something then.
Absolutely. Some said because they weren't working closely with me, they didn't realize how bad things were. They said I covered it up well, which I don't know that was such a good thing.
How are things now for you?
Things are incredible. It's a complete 180 from where I was, and I think having that support at that very crucial time, we know that when a woman leaves domestic violence, that's the most dangerous time. And I had so much support from my coworkers, from the city, from my family, that I was able to focus on my career and making a good life for my children. And today I'm successful and I'm happy, and I'm very proud of how far I've come. There's a whole nother life out there if you give yourself that opportunity.
Okay, well, Melissa, thank you for speaking with me.
Thank you.
Melissa Corbet, she was in our Ottawa studio. Now, her story is familiar to people who work in the area of domestic violence. Barb McQuarrie has helped abused women for decades. She's the community director of the Centre for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children in the Faculty of Education at Western University in London, Ontario. Ms. McQuarrie worked on this study with the Canadian Labour Congress, and she joins us from Ottawa. Hello.
Hello.
What were you thinking as you listened to Melissa?
I was thinking that she was lucky, and that we can't rely on luck to have that kind of positive response to women, and sometimes even in men who are experiencing this in their workplaces. We need to make that kind of response expected and consistent.
Okay, well, before we talk about the response, let's talk about what you have discovered. How does her story parallel the findings of the survey you've just done?
Well, we found that a full third of Canadian workers have experienced domestic violence in their lifetime, and for half of them, the abusive behavior actually continued while they were in the workplace. So that could be harassing phone calls, text messages, stalking, showing up, asking questions from supervisors or coworkers. Where is she? What's she doing? Who is she with? So many different ways that it comes to work.
And you also discovered, 12% of those people surveyed suspect a coworker to be an abuser at home.
They do. Yes. And so it's been an invisible problem only in that we haven't acknowledged it openly. So when we actually get down to talking to workers, we have a third of them who know that they've or believe that they are working or have worked with somebody who's experiencing domestic violence, and then the 12% who know or believe that they're working with somebody who's been abusive. And so we really do know, but there's been no avenue to talk about this. There's been no way to bring it out into the open.
Now, can I just clarify, this was an online survey over 6 months, am I right?
That's right.
And so who were the respondents?
Our partner was the Canadian Labour Congress, and so most of the respondents were unionized workers. It was open to anybody, and we got about 20% of respondents who weren't unionized. But these are largely people with quite secure jobs.
Okay, and so you got 8,400 people responded. How many people did you ask?
The CLC, the Canadian Labour Congress, has 3.2 million members, so I guess theoretically we asked all of them, and then anybody who they may have passed it on to.
Okay, and so statistically, are these solid results?
They are solid results. Our prevalence rates are very consistent with a lot of other data that's been collected about domestic violence, so we're quite confident.
Okay, and so you talk about the actual the statistics of what it looks like in the workplace. Can you give us an idea of how the kind of violence people are experiencing them can follow them to work? What people should be looking for, or what they might see and not recognize?
Okay, I think that the very most common way it would come is through those harassing phone calls, or increasingly more electronic means, text messages, emails. Stalking is also quite common, and so if somebody has left their abusive partner, where is the place they're going to find them? It's at work. And stalking is a very high-risk behavior. So when this starts to happen, we really need to pay attention. We need to have safety planning measures in place.
Because work is the predictable place, right? They show up every day at the same time. They leave at the same time.
That's exactly right.
So they're actually more vulnerable in some ways.
Leaving makes us somebody safer over the long term, but in the short term, that period of separation is absolutely the most dangerous. But there are other warning signs that we can look for in the workplace. They often show up as performance issues. So somebody who's, tired, distracted, not able to, has been a good employee and is now not performing up to their standard. It could be things that Melissa talked about, trying to hide bruises. It could be just being tired or being isolated and generally being afraid. It could be, you're noticing those harassing phone calls come in. Those are all ways that, it could show up.
Well, Barb McQuarrie, we have someone else waiting to join us. Natalie MacDonald is a founding partner of Rudner MacDonald. It's a law firm that specializes in Canadian employment law. She's the author of Extraordinary Damages in Canadian Employment Law. She's in our Toronto studio. Welcome.
Thank you, Anne-Marie.
I'm guessing as you listen to Barb McQuarrie that you've seen a lot of these stories up close.
We certainly have, as a matter of fact, and first of all, with the recent rash in domestic abuse cases stemming from scandals plaguing the NFL to Jian Ghomeshi, our society is having a wake-up call, and employers know that we must answer. The issue is employers don't know how to answer, and they don't know what the cost is involved in it.
Okay, well, what are the costs?
The costs, could be ranging from the programs that are available to the cost of losing out on the employee's attendance in the workplace. We know that we had Bill 168, which drove home the need for employers to have
That's in Ontario.
That's correct.
Right.
And under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, which it's now under, it touched upon domestic violence in Ontario, but it did not go far enough. It did not define what constitutes domestic violence. It did not provide guidelines as to what the employers need to do to be able to assist victims of domestic violence. Workplace violence, as we know, is different from domestic violence, yet it spills over into the workplace and has fundamental consequences.
Okay, the Canadian Labour Congress was a partner in this study, and Vicki Smallman is the National Director for Women's Rights and Human Rights at the CLC, and she says businesses could be playing an important role. Listen to her.
I think that it's really important to ensure that businesses are being proactive in addressing the workplace culture so that there's less stigma and fear of disclosing that you're actually experiencing domestic violence at home. Businesses can provide safety plans. They can give workers the time that they need to be able to do what they need to do, whether that's get a restraining order on somebody or go to court or move houses. That takes a lot of time and energy, and employers can be really proactively supportive.
Barb McQuarrie, this is some of the recommendations that your survey has come up with as well. You want to see more government, union, employee, employer, the whole mix working together on this.
We really need collaboration on this, and I would throw into that mix domestic violence experts. This is not a problem that any of us can solve on our own. We're going to need legislation, but we're going to need education. We're going to need thinking about the problem from the perspective of the employer, from the perspective of the employee, from the perspective of the union. And then we're going to have to look around our communities. We have really good resources to respond to domestic violence.
Well, let me just ask you, though, we heard at the very beginning of this program the story of Tony MacDonald, who was killed in a Starbucks trying to defend one of his employees from a domestic abuse attack. WorkSafe BC has brought in a bunch of guidelines and laws related to that. We saw in Ontario a nurse was killed by a doctor at Hotel Dieu Hospital in Windsor, and you mentioned that there's Bill 168 in Ontario. Are there not already provincial governments that look at this, that actually have policies?
Well, the case that you mentioned of the nurse being killed in Windsor was the impetus for bringing in the legislation in Ontario, and then Manitoba followed suit shortly after that.
And BC obviously has its legislation as well.
If they don't have legislation, they have guidelines. They've taken a more approach about educating. But this is in Ontario, we were the first to have legislation. That's 2010. This is very recent. We are not used to thinking about domestic violence as a workplace problem. And we have not really had that conversation with employers more broadly about what does it mean to have responsibilities to prevent and respond, and what resources can you look to. I think employers are really afraid that they will now expected to be experts in domestic violence, and that's not the case. That's not necessary. But we do need to build these collaborative relationships.
And Natalie MacDonald, what do you think?
I think Barb's 100% right. And my partner, Stuart Rudner, and I designed and created a program at Osgood Professional Development, which is called Advanced HR Law for HR professionals. Well, essentially, we teach an intensive training course based on case studies of all the aspects of what the employer's obligations are in the workplace and the employee's entitlements. And we've touched on domestic abuse. And we've been delighted to know there's resounding support for this and something that we have a lot of support for, but we do need the government to assist us because the cost of it could be very costly for employers who are small to medium organizations.
So we're almost out of time, but which government? Are you talking federal or are you talking provincial governments?
Both, absolutely. We need to make this a Canadian issue and fight it.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Thank you both for weighing in on this today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's Barb McQuarrie, Community Director for the Centre for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children in the Faculty of Education at Western University, and Natalie MacDonald, Toronto lawyer specializing in employment law and the author of The Extraordinary Damages in Canadian Employment Law. Stay with us. Coming next.
Hit and run, the method of the U-boat.